Theranos sold a blood testing machine that almost nobody outside the company was allowed to test. It promised hundreds of results from a few drops of blood. Investors gave the company more than $700 million. At its peak, the business was valued at about $9 billion. But according to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the proprietary analyzer could perform only a small number of tests. Most patient tests were run on modified or standard commercial machines made by other companies. The miracle box was the product. The machines behind the wall were doing most of the work. Welcome to Billion-Dollar Autopsy. This is Case File 10, Theranos, the blood machine nobody was allowed to test. The idea was almost perfectly designed for belief. Traditional blood tests can mean a needle, several tubes, and days of waiting. Theranos promised something smaller, faster, and less frightening, a finger prick, a tiny sample, and a broad menu of results. The company said its compact analyzer could make testing cheaper and more accessible. That was not just a business pitch, it sounded like relief. Parents imagined easier tests for children. Patients who feared needles imagined one small drop. Pharmacies imagined putting laboratory access beside the shampoo and toothpaste. Investors saw a technology that could enter an enormous medical market without asking people to change much about their lives. And Elizabeth Holmes wrapped the promise in a story about democratizing healthcare. The machine did not look like an ordinary laboratory instrument. It looked like a black consumer product from the future. Smooth, sealed, simple. That appearance mattered because it made complexity feel solved before the underlying science had been independently demonstrated. To understand the failure, forget the founder for a moment and follow the sample. A blood test is not one task, it is a collection of different chemical questions. One test may count cells, another looks for a hormone, another measures an enzyme, an antibody, or an electrolyte. Each question may require different preparation, calibration, reagents, and quality controls. Imagine a bakery claiming that one spoonful of batter can be divided after mixing and still reveal the exact amount of flour, sugar, salt, and butter that went into the original dough. Some measurements may be possible, others become fragile because the sample is too small, too diluted, or changed by handling. Blood is even less forgiving. A finger prick sample can be useful, but it introduces its own variables. Squeezing the finger, collecting tiny volumes, and moving the sample through miniature channels can affect the result. The challenge was never simply making a machine smaller. It was proving, test by test, that the smaller process was accurate, repeatable, and comparable with established laboratory methods. A normal medical claim becomes stronger when outsiders can challenge it. Scientists publish methods, laboratories compare results, regulators inspect records. Partners run validation studies before exposing patients to the service. Theranos built the opposite environment. Information was divided into silos. Employees were discouraged from discussing work across teams. Visitors and potential partners saw carefully controlled demonstrations. The device was treated as proprietary in a way that made ordinary verification feel like theft. Secrecy can be legitimate when a company is protecting an invention. But secrecy cannot substitute for evidence when the invention is producing medical results. That is the central distinction. A trade secret may hide how a machine works. It cannot remove the need to prove that the output is reliable. Theranos used the prestige of innovation to blur those two ideas. Asking to inspect the machine could be framed as lacking vision. Asking for the data could sound like demanding the recipe. In reality, the recipe and the result were different questions. Nobody needed Theranos to reveal every design secret. They needed the company to demonstrate independently and repeatedly that the tests worked. If the machine itself could not provide enough visible proof, the company needed proof from somewhere else. It found prestige. The board included former cabinet officials, military leaders, and famous statesmen. Their experience was real, but most were not laboratory scientists. Their presence answered a question investors were not supposed to ask them. It did not prove the analyzer worked. It proved that important people were willing to stand near it. Then came Walgreens. For Theranos, the pharmacy chain offered something more valuable than store space. It offered familiarity. A customer did not have to enter a mysterious Silicon Valley laboratory. They could walk into a place they already trusted. The Justice Department record says advertisements induced people to buy Theranos tests at Walgreens locations. The retail counter transformed a private technical claim into a public medical service. Every new layer of reputation made the missing validation easier to overlook. Famous board members reassured investors. Investors reassured partners. Walgreens reassured patients. Trust moved forward through the chain. Evidence did not. Now return to the blood sample. The public story suggested that a tiny amount entered a proprietary Theranos machine and produced a broad range of results. The official record describes something different. The Securities and Exchange Commission said the proprietary analyzer completed only a small number of tests. Most patient tests were run on modified or standard commercial analyzers made by other manufacturers. That does not mean every result was invented or every instrument was useless. It means the advertised system and the operational system were not the same. In some cases, small samples had to be prepared for machines designed to work with larger conventional samples. Each extra step creates another place where accuracy must be validated. This is the smoking gun because it changes the meaning of the entire product. Theranos was not merely late in finishing a promising machine. It was taking patient samples through a workflow that depended heavily on technology the company did not present as the heart of the service. The black box borrowed the credit. The ordinary machines carried much of the load. In software, a product can fail and annoy a customer. In medicine, a wrong number can change a decision. A result can send someone toward more testing, delay treatment, or create fear that should never have existed. That is why laboratory validation is repetitive and conservative. The system is designed to distrust a result until controls, comparisons, and records support it. Theranos presented that caution as old thinking. But the caution existed for the patient, not for the laboratory. This is also why the story cannot be reduced to rich investors losing money. Investors accepted financial risk. Patients entered a retail location expecting a medical result. The Justice Department case record describes tests sold through Walgreens and the use of third-party commercial analyzers, despite contrary representations. The exact legal counts matter. Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on investor fraud counts, while the jury did not convict her on every patient-related count. That distinction should not be blurred. But the operational reality still placed ordinary people inside a system whose public description did not match the process behind the wall. The system began to fail because people inside it refused to accept secrecy as an answer. Laboratory employees saw discrepancies between the public promise and the work they were doing. Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz, raised concerns from inside the company. Erica Chung also challenged laboratory practices and later contacted regulators. Their position was unusually difficult. They were young employees confronting lawyers, executives, and an organization surrounded by celebrated names. The company treated internal criticism as a threat, but the evidence did not require them to know every part of the business. They only needed to describe what they could observe, preserve records, and bring those observations outside the silo. That is how a black box is opened in the real world. Not with a screwdriver, with emails, quality-controlled data, testimony, and independent reporting. John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal assembled those fragments into a public story. Once the question changed from "do you believe the vision" to "show us how this test was run," the company's strongest defense became its greatest weakness. Secrecy leaves an absence. Documents give the absence a shape. Once the evidence moved outside the company, the story changed quickly. Reporting challenged the testing claims. Regulators examined the laboratory. Walgreens ended the relationship. Theranos voided or corrected large numbers of test results. The valuation that had depended on a future machine collided with the record of the current one, but corporate collapse is not the same as criminal proof. Prosecutors still had to show specific false statements, specific victims, and intent, The trial did not ask whether every ambitious promise in Silicon Valley is a crime. It asked whether investors were deceived about material facts, including what the technology could do, how it was being used, and what the business had achieved. That precision matters because failure alone is not fraud. A startup can be wrong. A scientist can make a bad prediction. A machine can arrive late. Fraud begins when uncertainty is presented as proof and inconvenient facts are hidden from the people supplying money or accepting risk. Theranos crossed that line not because its dream was impossible, but because the public story continued after internal reality no longer supported it. In January 2022, the jury convicted Elizabeth Holmes on 4 counts connected to investor fraud. It acquitted her on several other counts and did not reach a guilty verdict on every allegation. In November of that year, a federal judge sentenced her to more than 11 years in prison. The court also imposed a large restitution obligation connected to losses suffered by investors. The outcome was narrower than the popular version of the scandal and stronger because of that. The criminal case did not need to prove every bad result or every public exaggeration. It proved a defined scheme to defraud investors. Ramesh Balwani, the former Theranos president and chief operating officer, was convicted separately. These verdicts placed legal boundaries around a story that had often been told as a morality play. The machine, the Walgreens rollout, the revenue claims, and the private investor presentations were not just symbols. They became evidence. A jury looked at the difference between what outsiders were told and what the company knew, and found that difference criminal beyond a reasonable doubt on the counts of conviction. The legal story did not end at sentencing. In February 2025, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit affirmed Holmes's conviction, sentence, and restitution obligation. The appellate court rejected the central challenges and left the criminal judgment in place. Then came a quieter healthcare consequence. In 2026, the Department of Health and Human Services upheld a mandatory exclusion tied to the conviction. That decision matters because it returns the story to the place where it began, healthcare. The company became famous as a technology startup and collapsed as a fraud case, but the machine was always supposed to deliver medical information. Years after the black boxes disappeared, the formal consequences still recognize that setting. Investor money built the valuation. Patient testing made the promise real. Regulators, courts, and administrative decisions eventually connected those two worlds. The final record is not a simple verdict that innovation failed. It is a verdict that medical claims cannot be protected from scrutiny by branding, secrecy, or the social proof of powerful people. So what actually killed Theranos? It was not one reporter, one regulator, or one failed machine. The company died because the system around the machine required belief to move faster than verification. Every important relationship depended on the next person accepting the previous person's confidence. Investors saw a celebrated board. Partners saw famous investors. Patients saw Walgreens. Employees saw lawyers and secrecy agreements. Each layer made the company look more proven while making the underlying proof harder to reach. That is why the sealed analyzer is the perfect object for this case. It was not only a piece of hardware, it was a social structure. Smooth on the outside, divided on the inside, and protected by the assumption that somebody important must already have checked. But nobody else's confidence can answer a laboratory question. A result is accurate, or it is not. A method is validated, or it is not. Prestige can delay those questions. It cannot answer them. Once the documents escaped the silos, the entire valuation had to survive without borrowed trust. It could not. The lesson is useful because the next black box will not look like Theranos. It may be an artificial intelligence model, a carbon removal plant, a financial product, or a new medical device. The surface will change. The evidence questions will not. First, who has tested the central claim independently? Not admired it, not invested in it, tested it. Second, does the public description match the operating process? If the product is said to work one way while customers are served another way, the difference must be explained. Third, what happens to critics? A strong system makes room for bad news because bad news can improve the product. A fragile system treats questions as disloyalty. And fourth is prestige doing work that data should be doing. Famous names can open doors. They cannot validate chemistry, software, or financial controls. These questions do not guarantee safety, but they force the story and the machine into the same room. That is where Theranos failed. The company could display the story or protect the machine. It could not let outsiders compare them for long. Theranos promised that one drop of blood could reveal the truth about your body. In the end, one blood sample revealed the truth about Theranos. The advertised path and the real path were different. The company survived while those paths remained hidden from each other. It collapsed when employees, reporters, regulators, and jurors connected them. Every fortune leaves evidence. In this case, the evidence was moving through the laboratory the entire time. If you enjoyed this autopsy, like the video, subscribe for the next case file and share it with someone who would find it interesting. This has been $1 Billion Autopsy, Case File 10. Every fortune leaves evidence.